John Davis, a 42-year-old resident of a Seattle suburb, lived an ordinary, modest life with his wife Lisa and their two children. John worked as a mid-level manager at a local logistics company, while Lisa was a part-time administrative assistant at a nearby school. Their financial situation was tight. They had a mortgage they could barely afford, and most of their income went toward household expenses, leaving little room for luxuries or savings. Weekends were often spent doing repairs around the house or finding free or inexpensive ways to entertain the children. Despite their financial struggles, John and Lisa were used to their way of life. They had grown accustomed to balancing bills and making do with what they had. John's focus was always on providing stability for his family, though the stress of their financial situation sometimes wore him down. Lisa, while supportive, sometimes expressed frustration over their inability to afford things that others in their neighborhood seemed to take for granted. Family vacations, new cars, or even regular dinners out. Everything changed unexpectedly in June of 2018. John received a letter from a law firm in Chicago, informing him that he was the beneficiary of a sizable inheritance. At first, John was skeptical, thinking it was some kind of scam. He barely remembered the relative in question, a distant great-uncle he had only met a few times as a child. This man had lived a quiet life in the Midwest, and they hadn't been in contact for years. Nevertheless, after contacting the law firm, John confirmed the authenticity of the letter and learned that he was about to inherit $1.5 million. The news stunned John. The amount was far beyond anything he had ever imagined having. When he told Lisa about the inheritance, she was equally shocked, but excitement quickly overtook her initial disbelief. This windfall represented a chance to escape the financial burdens that had weighed them down for years. No more scraping by, no more worrying about bills, and perhaps most importantly, they could finally give their children the opportunities and lifestyle they felt they deserved. In the weeks that followed, John and Lisa's conversations revolved around how they would use the money. John, ever cautious, wanted to pay off their mortgage first and set aside a significant portion for savings and investments. He envisioned a more comfortable but still relatively modest life, where they wouldn't have to worry about money but wouldn't be reckless with it either. He talked about investing some of the money for their children's college funds and setting aside a nest egg for retirement. Lisa, on the other hand, had different ideas. She wanted to upgrade their lifestyle significantly, buy a larger home in a more prestigious neighborhood, replace their aging cars with newer, more luxurious models, and take their family on vacations they had only dreamed of before. For Lisa, the inheritance represented a complete change in how they could live, and she was eager to embrace the opportunities that this newfound wealth offered. At first, John was hesitant to agree to Lisa's more ambitious plans, fearing that they might burn through the money too quickly. However, Lisa's excitement was infectious, and after years of living paycheck to paycheck, he found it hard to argue against the idea of enjoying their good fortune. Slowly, he began to warm up to the thought of buying a bigger house and taking some vacations. He rationalized that they had worked hard their whole lives and deserved to enjoy the fruits of their labor, even if those fruits had come in the form of an unexpected inheritance. By September, John and Lisa had begun house hunting. They focused on properties in upscale neighborhoods, looking at homes that were far beyond what they had ever considered before. Their children, excited by the prospect of having their own rooms and a larger yard, joined them on visits to several sprawling properties. Each new house seemed bigger and more extravagant than the last, and Lisa reveled in the process of imagining their future in these luxurious spaces. Meanwhile, John quietly began to feel a sense of unease. Though he had agreed to move forward with Lisa's vision of a new life, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were getting in over their heads. The houses they were looking at required not just the money they had inherited, but also a commitment to a more expensive lifestyle overall. Higher property taxes, larger utility bills, and the expectation of keeping up appearances in wealthier circles. As they looked at houses, John also noticed that many of the real estate agents and sellers seemed to treat them differently, perhaps sensing that they were new to this world of affluence. Despite these concerns, John ultimately agreed to purchase a $1.2 million home in an exclusive gated community. It was a far cry from their modest suburban house, complete with a swimming pool, 5 bedrooms, and expansive living spaces. Moving into the new home was a whirlwind of activity, and Lisa quickly took charge of decorating and furnishing the space, excited by the possibilities of their new life. For John, however, the excitement of their sudden change in fortune was starting to wear thin. The practical concerns he had harbored from the beginning resurfaced as they settled into their new life. Although they still had money left from the inheritance, it wasn't as much as John had hoped to keep after the house purchase, and their new lifestyle was more expensive than he had anticipated. Lisa, in particular, embraced this new life with enthusiasm. Free from the financial concerns that had weighed on her for years, she threw herself into transforming the house into a luxurious space worthy of their new status. She spent hours shopping for high-end furniture, designer decor, and the latest technology to fill the house. She had a clear vision of how everything should look, and no expense was spared in making it a reality. In addition to the house, John and Lisa also upgraded their vehicles. They traded in their older cars for sleek new models, Lisa opting for a luxury SUV, while John settled on a high-end sedan. For Lisa, these purchases weren't just about practicality. They were statements of their newfound wealth. She wanted the world to see that they were no longer the same struggling family they had been before the inheritance. Travel quickly became another outlet for their newfound fortune. For years, vacations had been limited to road trips or budget-friendly destinations, but now, with money no longer an issue, they began planning extravagant trips. In the first year after receiving the inheritance, they traveled to Hawaii, Europe, and the Caribbean, staying in five-star hotels and experiencing a level of luxury that had previously been out of reach. Lisa reveled in these experiences, soaking up the attention and admiration from their friends and acquaintances as they shared photos and stories from their travels. As time passed, John found himself longing for the simplicity of their old life. He missed the sense of normalcy and authenticity that had defined their small suburban community. In their old neighborhood, friendships were built on shared experiences, not wealth or status. Now, in this new world, conversations revolved around material possessions, investments, and social appearances. The pressure to keep up with this affluent lifestyle was draining for John, and he couldn't help but feel like they were losing touch with what really mattered. John also began to worry about the financial implications of their new lifestyle. Though they still had money left from the inheritance, their spending had increased significantly. The new house came with higher property taxes, maintenance costs, and utility bills. Their vacations, cars, and social activities all added up, and John couldn't help but feel that they were living beyond their means. He tried to discuss these concerns with Lisa, but she brushed them aside, confident that they had more than enough money to sustain their new lifestyle. As the months passed, John's dissatisfaction grew. He no longer felt like he belonged in this world of excess and materialism, but he didn't know how to express this to Lisa without causing more conflict. He feared that their marriage was beginning to suffer as a result. The more Lisa embraced their new life, the more distant John felt from her. Their conversations became increasingly strained, with John often retreating into silence, rather than arguing about the direction their lives were taking. Despite his growing unease, John kept most of his concerns to himself. He didn't want to dampen Lisa's excitement or cause tension in their marriage, but internally he felt like he was slowly drifting away from the life they had built together. At home, the effects of Lisa's absence began to take a toll. John found himself taking on more responsibilities with their children, handling their daily routines, school activities, and family matters. With Lisa frequently out of the house, John felt like he was raising the kids on his own. Whenever he brought this up to her, Lisa would dismiss his concerns, insisting that she was simply networking and securing a better future for the family by building relationships with influential people. However, John didn't see it that way. He felt increasingly disconnected from Lisa, both emotionally and physically. Their conversations became more strained, often revolving around disagreements over spending or Lisa's social activities. John was growing concerned about their finances. Although the inheritance had provided them with a substantial amount of money, their extravagant lifestyle was draining their funds at a faster pace than he was comfortable with. The mansion they had purchased required constant upkeep, and Lisa's habit of buying luxury goods was becoming more frequent. John's attempts to talk to Lisa about these concerns only led to more arguments. Whenever he suggested cutting back on expenses or slowing down their spending, Lisa would get defensive, accusing him of trying to hold her back or acting out of jealousy. She had grown accustomed to the lavish lifestyle and wasn't interested in returning to the simpler, more modest way of living they had once known. For her, their new life represented freedom and success, and she couldn't understand why John wasn't fully embracing it. John couldn't shake the feeling that these people were only interested in Lisa because of the money. Whenever he mentioned this to her, Lisa would brush off his concerns, insisting that he was being paranoid and overreacting. She was confident that her new friends cared about her for who she was, not just for the wealth they had come into. However, John couldn't ignore the subtle changes he had noticed in her behavior. Lisa had become more concerned with appearances, more focused on the opinions of others, and more intent on keeping up with the lavish lifestyles of her new friends. Their arguments grew more frequent and more intense. John tried to express his concerns about their relationship, explaining that he felt like they were growing apart, but Lisa seemed unwilling to acknowledge that there was a problem. She would accuse him of being too negative or not understanding the importance of maintaining their new social standing. To Lisa, John's reluctance to embrace their new life was seen as a failure to support her ambitions. The tipping point came one evening when John, after a particularly frustrating day, confronted Lisa about the changes he had noticed in her. He told her that he felt like she was becoming consumed by materialism, and that her new friends were only using her because of their wealth. He also expressed his frustration with the way their relationship had deteriorated, pointing out that they spent little time together as a family anymore. Lisa, already irritated by John's continued criticisms, lashed out in response. She accused him of being jealous of her success and of trying to control her. She defended her friends and the lifestyle they were leading, insisting that it was their right to enjoy the benefits of the money they had received. She argued that John was stuck in the past, clinging to old ways of thinking, and that he couldn't see how much better their lives had become. The argument ended with John walking out of the room, deeply frustrated and unsure of how to reach his wife. He didn't know how to make her see that their relationship was unraveling, that the money had created a divide between them that was growing wider by the day. As much as he tried to communicate his concerns, it seemed like Lisa was unwilling to listen or compromise. John met Richard one evening at a social event that Lisa had insisted they attend. Richard was a charismatic businessman in his late 40s, known for his smooth-talking demeanor and impressive portfolio of successful ventures. He had a way of drawing people in, making them feel like they were part of something big. From the moment they were introduced, John could sense that Richard was different from the other guests at the event. He exuded confidence and seemed to have all the answers. Richard approached John during the event and, after some casual conversation, began talking about an investment opportunity that he claimed would yield incredible returns. It was a real estate development project that, according to Richard, was set to take off in a booming market. The promise was alluring: high returns, low risk, and a chance to increase the wealth that John and Lisa had recently acquired. At first, John was skeptical. He had always been cautious when it came to money, especially after experiencing firsthand how quickly fortunes could change. The idea of investing a large sum of their inheritance into a single project seemed risky, and he wasn't sure if it was the right move for their family. But Richard was persuasive. He presented the opportunity in a way that made it sound almost foolproof. He even mentioned several high-profile investors who had already committed to the project, which added a sense of legitimacy. Lisa, who had been standing nearby and overheard the conversation, immediately expressed her enthusiasm. She saw it as the perfect way to further cement their place in the elite social circles they had recently entered. The idea of multiplying their wealth excited her, and she encouraged John to seriously consider the investment. To her, it was an opportunity they couldn't afford to pass up. Despite his initial reservations, John found himself being swayed by both Richard's confidence and Lisa's eagerness. He knew that their financial situation had allowed them to live more comfortably than they ever had before, but the pressure to maintain that lifestyle was growing. Lisa had made it clear that she had no intention of returning to their previous way of life, and John didn't want to disappoint her. Over the following weeks, Richard and John met several times to discuss the details of the investment. Richard provided financial projections, market analysis, and a timeline for when the project would begin yielding profits. Everything seemed to be in order, and Richard's track record of successful ventures further convinced John that this could be a lucrative opportunity. Even though something in the back of his mind told him to be cautious, John ultimately decided to move forward with the investment. He transferred a significant portion of their remaining inheritance, well over half, into the project. It was a decision that weighed heavily on him, but he reassured himself that the potential gains would outweigh the risks. Lisa was thrilled with the decision, believing that they were on the verge of securing their financial future for good. For a while, things seemed to be going smoothly. Richard provided regular updates, assuring John that everything was progressing as planned. However, as the months went by, John began to notice small red flags. Communication from Richard became less frequent, and the timelines for the project's development started to slip. Whenever John reached out for updates, Richard always had an excuse: unexpected delays, market fluctuations, or regulatory hurdles. He always framed the setbacks as temporary, insisting that the project was still on track and that they just needed to be patient. John's unease grew with each passing week. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but every time he voiced his concerns to Lisa, she brushed them aside. She remained fully confident in Richard's abilities and was certain that they would see the returns they had been promised. Lisa had become close friends with several other investors in the project, and they all seemed just as confident as she was. But John couldn't ignore the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in his gut. One day, after several more weeks of silence from Richard, John decided to take matters into his own hands. He began digging deeper into the details of the project, trying to find out more about its progress. What he discovered shocked him. The project was a complete sham. John learned that Richard had a history of running similar scams, targeting wealthy individuals with promises of high returns on fake investments. The real estate development didn't exist, and the investors' money had disappeared without a trace. John's worst fears had come true. He had been swindled, and their family's financial security was now in serious jeopardy. When he confronted Richard, the man was nowhere to be found. Calls, emails, and messages went unanswered, and it became clear that Richard had vanished, taking John and Lisa's money, along with the money of several other investors, with him. John was devastated. He had trusted Richard and allowed himself to be convinced, despite his better judgment. Now, their family was on the verge of financial ruin. The loss was catastrophic. Not only had they lost a substantial amount of their inheritance, but their extravagant lifestyle had drained the remaining funds. The lavish house, the luxury cars, the frequent vacations, it had all been sustained by the belief that they would continue to grow their wealth. Now, with their money gone, they were faced with the harsh reality that they could no longer afford the life they had built. The impact on John and Lisa's relationship was immediate and severe. Lisa was furious with John for trusting Richard and for not being more cautious. She accused him of being reckless and irresponsible, blaming him for their financial downfall. The arguments between them, which had already been frequent, became explosive. John, filled with guilt and regret, didn't know how to respond. He had made the decision to invest, but he also knew that Lisa had pushed him to go through with it. Their financial problems were now impossible to ignore. Bills began to pile up, and the lifestyle they had grown accustomed to was no longer sustainable. They were forced to make difficult decisions, selling off assets, cutting back on expenses, and facing the reality that their dream of wealth and luxury had crumbled. John's suspicions intensified when he noticed Lisa had started meeting Richard again, the man who had scammed him. At first, he hoped it was innocent, maybe a discussion about getting their money back. But something felt off. One afternoon, Lisa left the house, dressed in one of her expensive outfits. John decided to follow her, staying far enough behind so she wouldn't notice. His heart raced as he watched her drive to a restaurant and meet Richard inside. John parked across the street, his stomach dropping as he watched them through the window. They seemed close, laughing and smiling. Lisa even touched Richard's arm. Though he couldn't hear their conversation, their body language said it all. John sat in his car, stunned. The betrayal stung deeply. Not only had Lisa drifted away from him, but she was now involved with the man who had ruined them financially. His suspicion turned into a full-blown obsession. When Lisa returned home that evening, John said nothing. He silently observed her, looking for any sign of guilt. Her normal behavior felt like an insult, as if nothing had changed. But to John, everything had. In the following days, he began checking her phone, finding vague messages between her and Richard. Though there was no direct evidence of an affair, the messages were suspicious enough to fuel John's growing paranoia. Finally, one evening, John confronted Lisa. "Are you seeing him?" he asked directly. Lisa froze, her face pale, before defensively accusing John of invading her privacy. She denied any wrongdoing, claiming her meetings with Richard were only about money. But John didn't believe her. The trust between them was broken beyond repair. As Lisa stormed out of the room, John sat in silence, realizing their marriage was beyond saving. The sense of betrayal consumed him, turning every interaction into a reminder of what they had lost. Not just their money, but their trust and the life they once shared. John's suspicions had now become certainty, and he knew there was no going back. One evening, driven by the overwhelming need to confirm his suspicions, John decided to follow Lisa again. His mind had been consumed by thoughts of betrayal, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she and Richard were hiding something. Lisa left the house in a hurry, dressed sharply, and John quietly tailed her in his car. She drove to the same restaurant where John had seen her before, the place that had become a symbol of his mounting paranoia. John parked outside, his heart pounding. He sat in his car for a few minutes, trying to collect his thoughts, but the urge to confront them grew too strong. Finally, he entered the restaurant. It didn't take long for him to spot Lisa and Richard seated at a table near the back. They were laughing, seemingly at ease, as if they didn't have a care in the world. The sight ignited something in John. He couldn't take it anymore. He stormed toward their table, his face a mask of anger. Lisa looked up, shocked to see him, and Richard's smile faded as he realized what was happening. John didn't even give them a chance to explain. "What the hell is this?" he demanded, his voice trembling with rage. Lisa stood up, her face pale. "John, it's not what you think," she stammered, but her words only fueled his anger. Richard, clearly uncomfortable, tried to stand as well, but John stepped forward, pushing him back into his seat. Lisa, caught between them, tried to de-escalate the situation. "John, please, let's go home," she pleaded, her voice shaky, but John couldn't hear her. The noise of the restaurant faded into the background as his focus narrowed on Richard. The argument turned physical in a matter of seconds. John grabbed Richard by the collar, pulling him up from his seat. Richard resisted, trying to push John away, but in the struggle, the two men knocked over a table. As the commotion grew louder, Lisa screamed, trying to get between them, but her attempts were futile. In the heat of the moment, John's eyes darted to the table. He saw a knife, an ordinary steak knife that had been placed there moments before. Without thinking, he reached for it. The next few seconds felt like a blur. In the chaotic struggle, John swung the knife at Richard, not fully realizing what he was doing. The blade found its mark, plunging into Richard's chest. Everything seemed to stop. Richard gasped, stumbling backward before collapsing onto the floor. Blood quickly pooled beneath him. Lisa stood frozen, her hands covering her mouth in horror, her eyes wide with disbelief. The restaurant fell silent as patrons watched the scene in shock. John dropped the knife, staring at his hands in disbelief. He hadn't planned for this to happen. He had only wanted answers, maybe to vent his anger. But now Richard lay motionless on the floor, and the reality of what he had done began to sink in. His mind raced, but no clear thoughts formed. He was in shock, unable to comprehend the full weight of what had just occurred. Lisa knelt beside Richard, tears streaming down her face as she tried to shake him awake. But it was too late. The man was dead, and the life they had all known had changed forever in a single, irreversible act. John took a step back, his breath shallow, as the restaurant staff called the police. He didn't resist when the officers arrived minutes later. After the murder, John was immediately arrested at the scene. The police found him in a state of shock, barely able to comprehend what had just happened. He didn't resist when they cuffed him and placed him in the back of the patrol car. As they drove him to the station, the reality of his situation slowly began to set in. The man he had killed was not just a stranger, but the man who had ruined his financial life and, in John's mind, his marriage. Now, because of one moment of uncontrollable rage, John's own life had fallen apart. At the police station, John was questioned for hours. The officers were methodical, asking him to recount the events in detail. John tried to explain that he hadn't meant to kill Richard, that the entire altercation had spiraled out of control. But the facts were undeniable. Richard was dead, and John had wielded the knife. While John remained in custody, the police began gathering evidence, including witness testimonies from restaurant patrons and staff who had witnessed the deadly confrontation. The prosecution quickly built its case, focusing on the escalation of the argument and the fact that John had used a knife during the altercation. Lisa, devastated by what had transpired, found herself caught in the middle of the investigation. As the only direct witness to the crime, she was forced to give a detailed account of the events leading up to Richard's death. In court, Lisa's testimony would be crucial. Despite her emotional turmoil, she couldn't deny what she had seen. Her husband had killed Richard in a fit of rage. The trial began several months after the murder, drawing significant media attention. The courtroom was filled with reporters, lawyers, and spectators, all eager to see how the case would unfold. John sat in the defendant's chair, his expression blank, as his lawyers presented their defense. They argued that John had not planned to kill Richard, emphasizing the emotional stress he had been under for months, his financial losses, his suspicion of Lisa's infidelity, and the pressure of their deteriorating marriage. They claimed that John's actions were the result of a momentary loss of control, a crime of passion rather than premeditated murder. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They portrayed John as a man consumed by jealousy and resentment, who had allowed his anger to drive him to murder. They focused on the fact that John had brought a knife into the confrontation, arguing that he had every intention of using it when he approached Richard and Lisa that night. Their case hinged on proving that John had acted with malice, and their witnesses supported their version of events. Throughout the trial, Lisa's testimony was the most damaging. When she took the stand, her voice wavered as she recounted the argument between John and Richard. She described how the situation had escalated, how she had tried to intervene, but ultimately, she couldn't stop the violence. The courtroom was silent as Lisa described the moment John plunged the knife into Richard's chest. Her words hung in the air, painting a vivid picture of the fatal encounter. John's lawyers tried to discredit Lisa's account, suggesting that her emotional involvement with Richard might have influenced her perception of the events. But Lisa remained firm, her testimony solidifying the prosecution's case. Despite their best efforts, John's defense team struggled to refute the evidence. John showed little reaction as the sentence was handed down, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. His fate was sealed. He would spend the rest of his life in Beaumont, Texas, a maximum security prison known for housing some of the country's most dangerous criminals.